Welcome to the Slut Next Door podcast, where we dive deep into desire, unravel kinks and fetishes, and explore the deliciously naughty side of self-discovery. I'm Beatrix Vale, an erotic audio creator, and your guide to all things kinky and curious. So let's begin. Today, I'm talking about a kink that makes people shift in their seat a little bit, whether that be from discomfort or arousal. And we're going to be talking about the home-wrecking fantasy. And there is a lot of tension behind this kink, maybe curiosity, judgment, even you might have a little thrill in regards to it. And that's exactly why I want to unpack it. Now, this episode is going to discuss the home-wrecking dynamic as a consensual fantasy only. I am not promoting real-life infidelity or harm. I am simply exploring the psychology behind this kink. So when I talk to men who are drawn to this dynamic, what I consistently find is this. They are not trying to destroy their relationships. Quite the opposite. They are not secretly plotting betrayal. Most of them love their partners and do not want anything to happen to their relationship. Many of them are deeply loyal men. So that leads us to wonder, it did for me, what is it then? Why does the idea of temptation, of being pulled, of being seduced away from something stable feel so intense? Why does the taboo hit so hard? So in this episode, I'm going to approach this kink the way I approach all of them, without shame, without sensationalizing it, and without pretending that it's something it's not. Now we're going to talk about what the fantasy actually represents, the psychology underneath it, with the ego, the power, the surrender, the validation. And we're going to talk about what it looks like in practice inside safe containers like role play or even hypnosis. Because fantasy is symbolic. It's a symbol. And very often what turns us on is really not the literal act of something, it's what it means. So if you've ever felt drawn to this dynamic and wondered what it says about you, or if you're just curious why it even exists at all, this episode is for you. Now, before I really dive deep into the topic of home wrecking, I'm going to bring a segment I started where I start every episode explaining what's currently making me feel like a goddess. Currently, this morning, I was able to notice that I have hit some personal health goals. And that always feels so good because when you hit health goals, you've been working at it. It takes work to be healthy. And it is definitely a theme of mine for the past, year, is treating my body like the temple it is. And also, this morning, I woke up 2 hours later than when I usually wake up, and I really did not like it. However, I feel like it's very much goddess energy when I'm able to forgive myself for taking those extra 2 hours because I was up too late. And knowing when the rest is needed. That is so goddess energy. Um, as I've mentioned on this podcast, I meditate daily. That is another way I tap into that power. And, this morning hitting those health goals, knowing that I'm nourishing my body instead of wrongly medicating it with food. And what I mean by that is food can be such an emotional habit, if we want to call it that. And I know you know what I'm talking about. I mean, there's the whole thing of you get broken up with, you eat a tub of ice cream. Like food can be soothing for our emotions. And so the past year has been all about, just kind of recentering myself because I know how to be healthy and knowing that this body is a temple and I'm going to nourish it and I'm going to respect it. And it just makes me feel like a goddess to know that I am hitting those goals. I am feeling strong. Every time I do spend time exercising, nourishing my body with health, it makes me feel so strong and like a goddess. So let's dive into the home wrecking kink. And we're going to start by defining what we're actually talking about. So, when people hear the word home wrecking, they usually imagine destruction because that word, that term, home wreck. I mean, when there's someone, especially a woman, that breaks up a marriage because she was having an affair with the husband, she's called a home wrecker. So that term, we associate it with very negative things, affairs, chaos, and especially when we use that term home wrecker as someone who's like intentionally trying to ruin a marriage, that's very scary. Those feelings, like it brings very negative, icky feelings. But in a kink context, that is not typically what's happening. So the home wrecking fantasy is about the idea of seducing someone who is already in a committed relationship. And so it's about temptation and persuasion and pulling at those emotions in a very clever way. Sometimes it involves dominance, and sometimes it involves validation. It can also mean for the person wanting the kink, the feeling of being pursued, of, even feeling chosen. And so I think that most men who are drawn to this dynamic really have no desire to actually damage their real world relationship. And I know that for a fact because I've spoken to men who are into this kink very intimately, and they are very happy and satisfied on, generally in their relationship. And this fantasy exists only in a contained space, in imagination, in role play, and in storytelling. And it's absolutely not about sneaking around in real life. It's never about really pulling that trigger and cheating on their partner. It's the role play of it. It's the fakeness of it in a way. And it becomes like psychological tension as well. And it definitely, I think, is about the moment where maybe their internal voice says, you shouldn't. You shouldn't even think about this. You shouldn't even look at it. And then another voice says, but I want to. And so it becomes this internal push and pull. And that is very charging. And I think that once we understand that, I think the word home wrecking, when we look at it in a kink setting, starts to look less like a literal plan and more like an emotional symbol. And like, hey, I get it. if I were a woman who was married and especially who didn't have her fingers in kink like I do currently, and I saw my husband looking at something called home wrecking porn or listening to a home wrecking audio, I'd flip my shit because, yes, on the surface, that looks terrible. But, and here's a big reason I started this podcast because kink and especially our human desires and our sexuality is really messy a lot of the times, and it's very complex. And so I love looking at these things in a non-judgmental way because it's very easy to bring up our judgments and our preconceived thoughts about something. It's very easy to pull them in. But when you think about kink, especially for someone who just kind of explores kink on their own through porn and that's it, like they don't take it into the real life, kink is absolutely this fantasy world. And, from what I've seen in my experience, it absolutely is and will always stand fantasy for a lot of men that are into home wrecking. And so I know it looks terrible. I'm actually expecting someone to to come across this podcast, maybe an upset wife, and say, no, this is all bullshit. Like none of this is normal. Blah blah blah. Well, like I respect that opinion, but I am giving my opinion from my view of kind of quietly observing and studying men and their sexuality and even women and their sexuality. And I'm just giving my opinion and my open minded perspective on what this kink is and what it looks like. So, with that said, let's talk about the taboo element of this kink because it is ultra taboo. Um, I don't think home wrecking really works without it because that's part of the appeal. And when something is taboo, it is very powerful, especially to certain people I've learned. I think some people are big taboo lovers. They're just kind of wired that way. Some people like it, some people don't like it. And what's interesting is taboo can mean a variety of things. For example, like people will call cuckold taboo. And in my world, cuckold isn't taboo at all. It's actually my favorite kink. And so, anyway, I think that most people would agree, though, that home wrecking is pretty damn taboo. It is not the default uh, way to look at relationships at all. But the our nervous system really responds to what feels forbidden. So when something sits just outside the lines of what we think is socially acceptable, it creates tension. And then that tension then turns very arousing. And then we can think about what's happening inside of our bodies and our minds. So when something does feel risky, we release adrenaline. And then when that adrenaline rises, our senses are then sharpened. We're designed that way. And, our heart rate increases. And so that kind of reaction becomes this activation, and like our bodies are activated, and then that can blend directly into arousal, and that becomes something like very appealing to a lot of people. And so if we look at this home wrecking kink or any taboo kink really that someone might be drawn to, it's not this isn't informing us that they want to behave in a destructive way because they're turned on by something. It simply means when you take away everything else, what it is the nervous system responding. And then with home wrecking, we also have these contrasts, um, loyalty versus temptation, stability versus chaos, control versus surrender. And that should sound familiar, good versus evil, good versus bad. I think that we like we like these kind of conflicts, So home wrecking has multiple layers of these conflicts, and that then creates again that charge, that activation, and then sprinkle into there. You've got this secrecy component, and like even though the kink is purely like imaginative, like a man's like, I would never cheat on my wife, but I'm into home wrecking. There's still that level of secrecy that adds a little bit of heat to the fire. The whole private scenario, the hidden pool, the the conversations that feel a little dangerous because our minds can like love edge, like edginess. Loves being like super close to the boundary of crossing that line and never crossing it, but looking at it and feeling that temptation. But, here's something important, I think, that I wish was more understood, that I think that taboo kinks like home wrecking are so often less about the literal scenario and more about the intensity of emotion attached to it. And so, you've just got this forbidden element that just acts like an amplifier, like turning the volume up. And so, yeah, I mean, that to me, that is the core of anything taboo. So when someone feels turned on by this home wrecking dynamic, it's really not because they want to hurt someone or hurt their relationship. It's really more about their nervous system and the chemicals going on in the body that light up in the presence of risk. It's the thrill of standing close to the line without crossing it. So, with that said, let's go even deeper. Let's strip away the taboo and let's strip away the adrenaline and those physiological responses. What is underneath this kink? So kind of more the emotions of this. So I think for many men that I've worked with within this kink, I think the first layer is validation. It's the feeling of being desired, chosen, prioritized, and that'll really, really hit the ego. It'll hit on self-worth and really help identify the sexuality inside. I say this a lot in my life, even outside of kink. We all just want to be seen. We all just need that validation. And so I think that is a layer of this kink. I think another layer of it is surrender. So a lot of men carry responsibility in their real lives. They are having to be decisive, dependable, stable, the ones who are supposed to hold the line. But this fantasy flips that. In the home wrecking dynamic, they are not the initiator. They are the one being pulled and persuaded and slowly unraveled. Someone else becomes the force. And there can be some relief in that. Relief in not being the anchor for a moment, relief and letting someone else drive the tension. And I find that a lot of men are drawn to role plays and kinks that involve corruption. So the feeling of being corrupted into temptation, especially when they have no choice in the matter. But another level or layer rather of this kink is the guilt element. And I find this one like super fascinating, really. And it's that push and pull between right and wrong. And it creates this sort of intensity, like, oh, I really shouldn't do this, but I really want to, just kind of like the angel and the devil on the shoulder type vibe. And I find it truly fascinating because maybe it's because I recognize that too, and fantasies that I've had in the past that involve a little of this guilt thing, the feeling of, oh, it's bad. I really shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to because it feels so good. It's so fascinating because the internal conflict becomes like fuel for the fire of the fantasy. It just adds more to it and makes it more intoxicating. And another layer of this as well, I think that the homewrecking kink functions as a safe container for rebellion. So stepping into the fantasy of destruction, really, without destroying anything in your real life. And you can explore temptation without ever acting on it, feeling reckless without actually being reckless. And so that this fantasy allows acting it out without any consequence. Now, let's look at what does this kink look like in practice, because you might be one of the people that maybe have heard about it, but you've never really gotten into it. You've never even attempted it. So what does it actually look like? Because it definitely is not acting out adultery, this home wrecking kink, home wrecking fantasy. Inside safe kink spaces, it is structured and contained. And what I'll do is explain a recent file I just created. I've created some home wrecking files, not too many though. But this recent one I did just was really good timing for me deciding to do this episode of home wrecking, because it is in my opinion, the quintessential example of safe home wrecking exploration. So there was no like role play as I'm your therapist or I'm your whatever, your coworker. It was simply, I'm going to put you into trance and I'm going to just kind of throw fuel on the fire of your home wrecking kink. And you're going to cheat by dropping into trance for me. Like there was no simulated sex in the file. There was no, we're going to have sex. No mention of that. Actually, I said, this is how we have sex. You submitting in trance and me dropping you into trance. That's how we have sex. And so that's all it was. And so this provided a container for someone to listen to this file, feel what it's like to be seduced and tempted into quote unquote cheating. And that's it. There was nothing outside of it. Um, when that file is done, there should be no further thoughts of I'm going to cheat on my wife, or I'm going to, this wedge is going to be placed between me and my wife. Like nothing happens outside of that container. It simply happened within that file, and that's that. It was definitely a lot about corruption, temptation, seduction, and nudging the listener there. So, another way that people can explore homewrecking kink is through role play files, like I mentioned, like hypnosis files. Even there's some porn out there where people are, portraying a homewrecking kind of fantasy setting. And so the listener or the viewer presses play on this piece of content. They know that they're in a constructed experience and they enjoy the king for what it is there, and that's that. And in role play, often it looks like a dominant woman teasing the idea of cheating, uh, reframing loyalty as something fragile, playing with the fantasy of, being with me is going to be more exciting. I'm going to be better than her. It's just kind of that teasing element. Sometimes it's pretty playful. Um, in my experience with the content I've created, it's a lot more slow and psychological and uh, deep and dark. and it, I think a common theme though is there's that element of validation and surrender though. And I'll give you a little honest confession. So, as a woman who has, created a home wrecking fantasy through files, creating these files absolutely turned me on because I am turned on by power. I'm turned on when I am a force and a force strong enough to change someone. And so with home wrecking, it becomes I'm the most powerful person in the room. If, hypothetically, if me and your wife and you were in a room, I'm the most powerful because I can make you do whatever I want while she can't. And it has nothing to do with the wife. Like, I don't care. Let me say, I care about her. I actually hope people stay together because I believe in love and happy endings. I'm actually a pretty mushy, gooey person. But this may sound twisted even. I I am happy to be the person that creates this fantasy world where a man can safely explore this kink that he's attracted to and not do anything outside of his marriage. Like to keep him from being tempted by a real, you know, temptation, a real quote unquote home wrecker. I think that is a lot more safe and that makes me more happy. But going back to what turns me on, it really is a power play because that is the core of my sexuality and my age is the power. Um, I love also using psychological tricks to seduce men. I love being in a role where I get to seduce and corrupt. So absolutely love leaning into the home wrecking kink. And I will say, if you are approaching other content creators or online sex workers about home wrecking, be careful because there are some harmful actors out there. What I mean by that is they really, I don't think they have your best interest in mind. And I've heard horror stories about, um, people being into a little bit of blackmail role play. And so they find like a content creator that says they do blackmail role play, and then the crazy bitch turns it real, and they threaten contacting spouses and weird stuff, just like real sabotage. That's like crazy person territory. Now, if you entered a role play dynamic where you are playing with those ideas, then that's fine. But if you didn't consent to role playing within that container, then that's dangerous. That creates real fear. I've done blackmail role play in the past, and I know that a lot of people that are in the blackmail want it to feel real. I think it goes back to that whole push and pull thing, the weird like intensity that we have when there's a conflict internal. Um, but it's like, I think they're like, do I want this or do I not want it? Which one is it? But anyways, I had no issue telling them, like, listen, I am never going to inflict real harm upon your life. I don't have any motivation or will or want to do any of that. But when we are in this role play scenario, I'm going to make you feel scared as fuck. And that's a turn on. Like, that's a turn on. If they want that. See, here's the key. Consent. I mean, all power exchange should be consensual. If you listen to any type of kink talk, consent is truly everything. Because if you go into a dynamic and you say, hey, I'm really into XYZ, well, that dominant person is going to be like, okay, well, I'm going to give you XYZ. But if you go into that dynamic saying you like XYZ, but then they give you ABC, that becomes not kink. That becomes betrayal and can create fear and just lots of yucky stuff. So back to home wrecking. I think for a lot of men, they just want to feel tempted and are looking for fantasies, role plays, content where there's a dominant figure, amplifying that feeling of temptation, exploring that, like stretching it, manipulating it. And when I say manipulate, I mean like just using that need for the of feeling tempted and, oh, well, you'll do anything for me, huh? Well, let's just test that, shall we? It's a play on that emotion. And again, because it's so important, all of this should be consensual. It's about stepping into a symbolic narrative where desire feels dangerous, but then stepping back out into safety when the scene ends. And so there's this container of Homewrecking Kink that made it safe. Nobody got hurt. No one is going to get hurt. It is a fantasy world that was built that you can put away, you can come back to it again, or not ever again at all. It's this container, it's here, it's safe. And when it's done responsibly, it is not about wrecking anything, and more, I think, about exploring that psychology of temptation. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about boundaries. Because when we explore taboo dynamics, I think it's very, very important to separate fantasy from behavior very clearly. Desire does not automatically equal intention. And I had a whole podcast episode on this. Fantasy does not automatically equal endorsement. Most people use kink as, just an exploration, especially for those symbolic, um, imaginary desires that they have. They are engaging with feelings inside, and those feelings are like power and temptation and ego and surrender. And they're not using kink for drafting some plan for real life action. And in fact, I would argue that for many, having that contained fantasy space reduces the urge to act impulsively. It gives, your internal need to explore this kink a way to experience whatever you're experiencing safely. But that containment absolutely matters. Now, if someone is already in a very fragile relationship, I wouldn't suggest this kink because I believe that you're going to the kink when you should be dealing with what is making your relationship so fragile. Um, I think if someone is using kink to avoid difficult conversations in their real life, I think that's a sign to slow down or, look outside the container of kink. I think that kink exploration should expand your self awareness and actually can make you a stronger person, but it's definitely not fracturing your self awareness. And this is where the element of consent becomes layered because it's not just consent between two people that I'm talking about right now, it's internal consent. And so, what I mean by that is being able to ask yourself, am I engaging with this because it feels playful and powerful? Or am I engaging in this because I'm trying to escape something that I need to address? The fantasy of it all should stay symbolic. And that's a good question to ask yourself if it's your kink or any other kink really. Am I diving into this because it's something symbolic that I'm needing to work on internally? Or, am I healing from something, whatever it is? Because the goal of kink should be exploration, never, ever harm. So, another very important question to bring up in this episode is who is this kink of homewrecking not for? Because I think that's an important question. I think that if you notice that the homewrecking kink dynamic creates real anxiety instead of erotic tension, that matters. Um, and so if you feel destabilized afterward, if the guilt is lingering in a way that feels really heavy instead of something that's more charged and exciting, or even if those lines of fantasy and impulse start to blur, all those things are worth paying attention to. Not every fantasy out there is meant for everyone. We're all unique. We're all individual snowflakes. Homewrecking may work really well for some people to escape to, while it may not. And I think that, and I've seen it, some people just really thrive on more taboo kinks, where others feel more safe and most aroused inside something more stable. And neither is good or bad, neither is better than the other. It's just different wiring. Now, I think another important thing is timing when it comes to this kink. So if your relationship is already fragile, as I mentioned before, if you're feeling disconnected from your partner, or if you're using this fantasy as a substitute to communicate, those are all huge signals. When engaging in any type of kink exploration, it should feel like you're learning something about yourself at some level, whether it's deep or shallow. It should never feel like you are breaking internally or pure avoidance. And, if you ever if you were curious about the Homewrecking Kink, tried it out, and it felt uncomfortable in a way that was not sexy at all, that's okay. For some people, it's going to feel really, really electric and symbolic. Both of those responses are valid. Neither is better than the other. I think self-awareness is the real skill here. And, that makes me think about porn in general and even kink. I think that a lot of people like to place the blame on porn, and I don't think it's porn's fault. Because porn takes some self-awareness and some responsibility as well, self-control. So anyway, I won't get onto that tangent, but let's bring this all together, okay? So the Homewrecking Kink is usually not about destruction. There are some bad actors out there that I think want that, but we're talking about the safe container where it's never about real destruction. Homewrecking kink becomes about intensity, validation, surrender, letting someone else become the force that pulls. And then it's about the taboo, those funky little chemicals that work inside of our brains and bodies that make us respond in interesting ways. And when Homewrecking Kink is explored responsibly, it will exist inside a container. And the narratives that happen inside that container are completely separate from the real world and real world behavior. So if the Homewrecking Kink resonates with you, it doesn't automatically mean you want to harm your relationship. I think it may simply mean that you may be responsive to that psychological tension that it brings, to the power shifts and to that thrill of standing close to the line. And if this kink doesn't resonate with you at all, that is just as valid. The goal is not to convince anyone to like a kink. That's never my goal. My goal here is to understand why it exists and look at it from a perspective that is open and honest. And I truly believe that when we start to understand the psychology underneath our desires, that's when we stop fearing them and start relating to them consciously and really start to grow and become better people. And I think that that's where true power lives. Thanks for listening. Until next time. And that's a wrap for this episode of The Slut Next Door, where we dive deep into the raw, unapologetic truths of human desire. If you loved what you heard today, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a juicy moment. Want to connect with me outside the podcast? Click the link in my bio, where you can find lots of juicy content and options. Until next time, I'm Beatrix Vale, your Slut Next Door, and I'll see you in the next episode.